Hello class. In this video we will be recapping what we learned concerning Section 2033. In particular, we will be looking at statutory provisions regarding what will be included in the gross estate. What code sections do we look to decide what is in the gross estate? Well, basically, we looked at 3 code sections in week 5, and with respect to code section 2033, we can view this code section in a way to say, I can give it away through my will. It's basically probate property in this context that we're going to use it. So as a recap of the tax process, we start off with the gross estate. Well, this is basically where we are in dealing with code section 2033. And then, of course, from the gross estate, you subtract the deductions. This is very simple, simplistic illustration of taxable estate. And then we get down to the taxable estate. But our starting point is Section 2033, which reads as follows. The value of the gross estate shall include the value of all property to the extent of the interest therein of the decedent at the time of his death. So what does this mean? It means that property that is subject to the decedent's testamentary power of disposition, basically property I can give away in my will, are included. Those assets included by the decedent's will are what's going to be included. It is whatever property that is effectively being disposed of by the will of the decedent. This is basically probate property in short. So moving forward, we will refer to Section 2033 property as probate property. And for this purpose, it will be property in which the decedent holds title. This does not include a trustee who has title to property for the purpose of managing the property. The trustee doesn't own the property. And we talked about that, and that came up in our discussions. So property, again, in this context that we're going to use it, is not necessarily property subject to probate administration. A proceeding in a probate court is not subject to normal administration. It is the property whose testamentary disposition is controlled by the decedent's will and is subject to the estate's creditors. So, again, probate property is property passing that is not set aside, such as a spousal set aside that keeps that property from going into probate. So let's start with our first illustration. So we have G, who's the grantor, and he puts the property into a trust. D has income for life, and the remainder goes to X. Obviously, D is the decedent. A typical income interest of this nature is going to be that income for life with the remainder to X, and D's interest terminates at D's death when his life ends. And D would have no control, basically, over any of the assets at death. So there would be no property interest in this situation to worry about. Now, change the example a little. On the next example, we have G, the grantor, who sets up an income interest that goes to D for 10 years. And that's an income term. And then the remainder goes to X. Well, if D dies before the income term ends, say 7 years into this, so that there would only be 3 years worth of income that belongs to D left. Since D had a 10-year term interest in the income, the remaining portion of the income term is something that D can control. So I don't have it listed here, but that the remaining 3 years out of the 10 years that is left is in D's control. And what does that mean? That means that D has the ability to give the remaining portion of that income to anyone D wants. So there is thus an income interest that D can dispose of in testamentary fashion. Now the next illustration, we'll change it up a little bit again. In this situation, the same would be true if D's income interest is for life, but now we're going to say it's measured on the life of G, the grantor, and not on D's life. So this income goes to D for G's life, which means that D is basically going to get this income for some indefinite period because we don't know when G is going to die. So in this case, if G does in fact die before D, if in this case, if D dies before G, D that is going to be our decedent, then D can give that remaining amount away in testamentary fashion. And this would be included in D's gross estate under Section 2033. So again, if D in this situation, if D dies before G, the fact that D held on to that property, you're going to include that in D's gross estate. Now, if D has no control to appoint the income, then we'll look at some other examples that are going to follow. So these examples are where D has no control to appoint the income. So on this next example, if X has the income interest this time and D has the remainder interest, in this case D has a vested interest in, of course, this remainder. The remainder is going to await basically X's death. So if D predeceases X, he has testamentary control over the remainder interest, and it would be includable in D's gross estate. Change it up again. Now, in this example, if D, in this situation, you have the grantor sets up the trust, income goes to X, remainder to D if alive, and if not, if he doesn't survive, then it goes to E. So basically, if D predeceases X, he gets the remainder basically, okay? And at D's death, with X alive, D has nothing to give away. So there would be nothing in this situation for D to include. Now let's just talk a little bit about successive interest in property, which is successive interest, as we discussed in the discussion sessions, are your remainder and your income interest. So remember, you need to determine the entire value of the trust, then determine the remainder interest or income interest on an actuarial basis, which is found in Code Section 7520, using the tables in Regulation Section 20.2031-7D. So all we're talking about is identifying the includable interest and where you need to go to do that. So this next illustration deals with tenants in common. And you go through the same thing with undivided interest. So let's say in this illustration that we have tenants in common. If D has an undivided interest with E, we know that with a tenancy in common, either party can give away their interest to whomever they choose. Now, let's say that D has a 1/3 interest and E has 2/3 interest. Well, D's 1/3 interest at death is what is included in D's estate when there are tenants in common. The 1/3 interest might carry a discount, such as a minority interest or possibly a lack of marketability discount. And how do you do that? You take the value of the property as a whole, you take the interest portion owned, and take the appropriate discount, and that is the value to include. And on our final illustration, we'll look at community property. So with respect to community property, in this illustration, D owns 1/2 of the property, and S, who is the spouse, owns the other half. And this is because it's community property. So 1/2 of the property interest is included in D's estate, D being the decedent. And consideration of a discount depends on the type of property this is. Obviously, if it's cash, it's not going to be discounted. Marketable securities would not get discounted. So discounts are not automatic just because you hold a fractional interest. Finally, with respect to Section 2033 property, it's reported on the 706 form on the schedule that relates to the type of property held by the decedent at death. So for example, it is reported on the schedule related to the kind of property held by the decedent at death. So if it's real estate, it's on Schedule A. If it's securities, it's on Schedule B. If it's cash or cash-like property, it goes on Schedule C, and so on. Other rules of inclusion generally have their own schedule, and it's reported on the schedule regardless of the type of property owned. Finally, if you're dealing with a living trust, it avoids probate since the property isn't being disposed of by a will. It's a testamentary disposition and is governed by the will itself. Now, while it's not taxed under Section 2033, you still are going to have to deal with how a trust, where that trust property is going to be reported on the Form 706. And in California, the estate tax auditors prefer property held in a living trust be reported where property is normally reported under Section 2033. So that's with respect to California auditors. So that's it for Section 2033. Hopefully that sums it up for you and helps to clarify everything. Thank you, and we'll go on to video 2, dealing with Code Section 2040.